Need a search engine optimization SEO services? Then get in touch.
Sorry about that. Don't worry.
Need a search engine optimization SEO services? Then get in touch with our professional and friendly team to learn more about our range of custom and tailored services designed to suit your exact needs. Every one of our professionals have acquired years of experience, which ensures you get the very best. Our experienced staff is waiting to hear from you and to answer any specific questions that you may have on how we can meet your needs. Just ask for a consultation and let us prove our commitment to you as we promise to maintain the highest level of quality and commitment. Your satisfaction is our prime concern. So please, don't hesitate to get in contact with us and let us show you all the great options we have.
All right, good evening. Welcome. It is Tuesday, 7:40 p.m., and we are on Pump Up the Volume, where we amplify the voices of community, press truth against establishment and status quo figures that attempt to tell us that everything is fine when we all know that more change is needed. So joining me today, we have, as always, Mr. Bill Bartholomew from the Bartholomew Town podcast. So it's a privilege to have Bill here again. Mr. Roberto Gonzalez from Steambox, Rhode Island. It's great to have Roberto back. Mr. Pat Ford, founder of the Coalition Radio Network, which we are streaming through, and also one of our guests and someone who is known for pushing against the establishment and challenging the status quo. We also have the privilege and an honor of having a special guest with us today, Kia Bryant from DARE. So thank you so much, Kia, for joining us today. Kia is the executive director, to be very clear, of DARE, Direct Action for Rights and Equality, and represents much of the movement that's happening now on the ground and the pulse of what's going on here in the state of Rhode Island. So we have the privilege of having Kia. So what I'd like to do, unlike the kind of normal routine where we start with Bill, kind of have news updates and kind of go around and address the top 3 topics, which today, for the most part, we know what they are. But the first one being one of the most controversial, one of the most important topics here in America and in the state of Rhode Island, this idea and this plan to defund the police. I felt like it was important, and we all felt that it was important to really gain some perspective on what that means. And, of all of the different approaches to what defund the police is, what Kia believes is the best plan to improve the safety of communities and to build a better future for our youth and here in the state of Rhode Island. So Kia, thank you for being with us here today. Welcome, and the floor is yours. Oh, Kia, you're on mute, I think. So just wanted to make sure I let you know.
Sorry. Yep. There you go. Thank you. So thanks for having me on. This is strange but exciting. Yeah, I appreciate it. So defund the police, to me at least, means that we stop putting money into police departments that are not set up to protect communities of color. Stop putting money into police departments that only harm communities of color. They don't do any good for us. They're not there to protect us, so why should we be giving them so much of our money? But it also means reinvesting into Black and Brown communities. It means giving money to Black folks to create services, create programs, to create systems that are for them, by design, right? We're so often left out of conversations with city and state politicians when it comes to our safety and well-being. But this defunding the police and putting money into the hands of Black and Brown communities gives us the chance to actually design programs that we feel we need, because nobody knows better than us, right? So we put that control in our hands, and we do what we need to do. We do what sees fit, right? It also means reducing the amount of police officers that are in the city, patrolling, um, causing harm to communities of color, creating safe spaces for Black and Brown folks to just be themselves, right? To just be Black and Brown in peace without anybody telling them what to do, without anybody calling the cops on them, telling them that they don't belong in a certain neighborhood. Yeah, that's what defunding means to me. So often, when you hear about defunding, especially here, a lot of our politicians, or even just folks who are not totally in favor of getting rid of the police department, like abolishing the police, they say reallocating funding to communities, reallocating money to the communities, but they don't talk about what that actually is going to look like, right? Like, if you're going to pull money from the police, you're going to have to remove salaries, which means you're going to have to terminate folks, because you need the proper amount of money to put back into the communities. How much money do we need for schools? How much money do we need for social service programs that are designed for Black people by Black people? Why do we need to have a mounted command, right? Like, why do we need to have so many narcotics dogs? We have to address root causes of harm, root causes of crime, and discuss ways that we can stop relying on police when they're not really helping us. Ways that we could rely on community and build trust amongst ourselves, so that we rely on each other, that we're no longer defaulted to dial 911 when it's not necessary. Yeah, that's it. I feel like I'm rambling.
No, I mean, thank you for sharing that. You're not rambling at all. So I do want to have everyone, kind of contribute their perspective. But before we move on to everyone else, I just want to address two questions, right? So when we hear about defund the police and understanding that there are those that say reallocation of resources, and then those that say completely abolish, there are two questions I have. One relates to technology, right? So in the event that we had less of a human force, is it also expected that we would have less of a technological mechanism in terms of surveillance? Or is it expected that we would replace human force with some type of technology that could have the same, to some extent, some level of intervention and observance without as much of the potential risk for obviously what we're seeing, which is abuse? Is that an element is that a part of the discussion when we think about technology and policing?
It's not a part of any discussion that I'm having. I know that there are people having those discussions, but not in a way that's helpful. And I don't necessarily see any helpful way in that, because when we talk about abolishing, we're talking about abolishing policing, period. And surveillance is a form of policing, right? We're talking about bringing power into communities that have historically never had it. We're talking about tearing down a system that is inherently racist to its core. So adding surveillance to that, adding technology to that is or has potential to be faulty, is not something that we're talking about at all.
Okay. And the second question is timing. So oftentimes I've heard people that kind of hear the idea of abolishing the police, and they assume automatically that there will never be another system or structure in place. So when we think about a practical a practical path, if you will, hypothetically, of police being abolished is the assumption that we would have a system already designed that would immediately take over so that there's very little gap time that could jeopardize the safety of communities, or is that completely off, and is that gap time just expected to be kind of something that we exist in until things normalize, right? So what's your perspective on
So
what it
for
means to
me,
actually practically abolish? Yeah, sorry.
yeah, for me, I think those two things need to happen together, right? So we're talking about defunding the police, abolishing the police, but also developing systems to replace them. Those things have to happen together. But in order for those two things to happen, we have to discuss what policing means. We have to discuss, um, we have to get people used to the idea of not having police. So that means gradually over time, scaling back on the amount of police we have in the city. So right now we have 443. Um, my idea is to cut that number by 100 in reducing departments that don't we don't need, right? They're not necessary, in reducing the amount of police or staff that the police department has for specific things that could be done by one person, could be done by a civilian, does not need to be done by a police officer, period. Um, that's what we're talking about. I don't know if that answered your question.
Okay, so you're looking at, I wouldn't call it a conservative path because no one would call this conservative, right? But you're looking at a gradual path towards diminishing the size of the force by looking at areas of consolidation, and then getting to a point where if you normalize communities around, existing with the smaller force and kind of depending more on one another within the community, then furthering that into eventually getting into a society that doesn't rely heavily on community policing. So that's kind of your vision. I just want to kind of summarize it. Okay.
Yeah,
Well, I
basically
think it
that's
is
my vision.
important. All right. Awesome, Kia. Thank you for sharing that. So I do want to kind of like see whether that vision and even that understanding aligns with some of our the individuals, right? Our co-host here on Pump Up the Volume. So just to organize this, why don't we go ahead and start with Roberto? We'll go to Bill, and then we'll go to Pat after. So Roberto, would you like to share your perspective?
I'm sorry to say, Kia's my homie, and I see it, like I get it, right? Like this, the two distinct ideas of abolish the police versus defund the police, right? Like, and defund to me means starting to strip away at some of their bloated budget and starting to take away some of those things and reallocate them into community resources, right? So there is that idea, but abolishing the police, which Kia led to, right? Like over time we could abolish the police. Kia is really thinking about the community, and Kia is really thinking about managing the impact that will have on the community. And I've had enough impact already by the police themselves, period, right? Like, so I'm all for, let's abolish the police today. I know it's going to scare people.
Yes.
I know
I'm
people
not
are going
scared.
to be upset. Thank you, Pat.
Amen.
But like, I get it. I get what Kia is saying, and I understand that what I'm asking for is not likely here. It's more likely in some boiling point scenarios, some places like Minneapolis and some other places, or some like ultra progressive places. And what they could do is, by replacing them, there's already systems and templates in place where you can have community wellness initiatives. So There is a template there, and it is possible to do it. I want to go in like hard and fast because I'm sick of the shit. But Kia's right. Kia's method is more approachable. So I just want to make it clear, and I know I've said it before on the show, I am definitely for abolish, but I will take defund the police as a consolation. And even that seems like a wish list item.
Yes. I mean, I'm for you. I'm with you. Like, I'm totally for just getting rid of the department, period. Right. But our people are not there yet. And that's the reality. And so much education still has to be done to get them there. a lot of unlearning, right? Changing the way we think about police, changing the way that we think about safety, changing the way that we think about each other is something that it's a huge lift. But I think because of coronavirus and this grand uprising, I think we can get there.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that, Roberto, and thank you, Kia. So, Bill, you've seen all of the different perspectives out there, being a part of the independent media, and obviously you have your own perspective as well. So, really interested in your thoughts on this.
Yeah, we live in a state right now where we can't even seem to get people on board with the notion that Providence Plantations is, offensive at any level. You still have basically an establishment rule here. Having grown up in the sticks, and having lived on Aquidneck Island and in Providence, I've seen and frankly, having grown up nearby part of my family right here in Elmwood, so I don't see that enough has changed. A lot of times with things, whether it's politics or, activist goals, I feel that there's always that inside baseball crowd, where we all, probably everyone on this call agrees and has the same fundamental opinion about what we need to do, not only when it comes to police and other law enforcement operations, because this goes beyond police into the private sector, the security sector. Okay, this even bleeds into the National Guard. But as a pragmatic step, I tend to lean where Kia's going. And one thing I look at is school resource officers, okay? That's something that I hear from on a regular basis that is just an apt. I mean, you can look at footage of, you got these clowns body slamming people in Narragansett and Pawtucket. I lived in Brooklyn for a decade down there. Just the behaviors of some of these individuals and some of the relationships that I had with parents and kids who were in various schools in Brooklyn. That's something that immediately can be dealt with. And I agree with the bloated department. Now, I spoke with, just this morning, I spoke with someone who is a high-ranking law enforcement officer that's roughly my age, that basically is in charge of a department here in Providence. And it's not the Providence Police Department. It's one of the universities. And we have significant disagreements. But that person does agree that police departments are bloated, that many of these folks are extremely undertrained. And we've got to look at the union issue as well, where it's very difficult, whether you're talking about the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, it's difficult to can people who are bad police officers. So I think those pragmatic reforms need to happen immediately. At the same time, just like with Providence Plantations, just like with Columbus, just like, frankly, with every social issue that is being brought to the surface, communicating to your average person in Ashaway, your average person in Narragansett. What does an average person mean? The average thinking process that I think if you polled the state, I would be surprised if you were able to find more than 85, or I think it would be around 85% of the people would say, defund the police, you're out of your mind. Another side, and I'll wrap this up quickly, is that you have a safety issue where, look, gun safety, and just broadly, I mean, are we all prepared to train at some level, whether it's with weapons or in martial arts, in a way where we can go back to when Rhode Island was founded and right in the original Providence on College Hill, where posse rule, and you can read about trials where there were people arrested by posse rule under Roger Williams. There were no cops. It's just that we were able to contain human nature that got out of control. And who decides that? So what kind of relationship does posse rule have with the court system? These are things that, am I willing to do it? I probably would. Is your 47-year-old mom in Pawtucket or, Patuxet, or pardon me, that's in Connecticut, in Westerly, whatever, ready to do that? I'm not sure they're ready to take martial arts or weapons training to be able to step up when there's a situation, much like a volunteer firefighter corps. So I'm with Kia. It's although I think we're all on the same page that, yeah, it's beyond belief how out of control the situation has gotten with respect to the racism, classism, and frankly, lack of discipline that we see out of many of the police officers in this state.
Yeah, Thanks for sharing that, Bill. So yeah, Roberto, you had a quick comment?
I couldn't let that go without touching on the idea of Rhode Islanders learning martial arts and together. It just seems like the dopest idea I've ever
Why
heard.
not?
Like if that doesn't happen, I at least want to see the movie. But also, I think it's important. I think it's important that one more time. I know we all said it. I know we all agree. But I think for your listeners, I just want to make this as simple as possible. That there is an absolute huge difference in what we're talking about between abolish the police and defund the police. Defund the police starts to regulate some of their finances and redistribute some of it into the community. The police officers that you all have the highest respect for and the ones in your family, they all keep their jobs. They're all still here. I think Kia talked about there might be some reductions in sizes of the officers, but the police maintain and they stay as is, but some of those funds start to be reallocated. That's what defund the police means. There's a huge misnomer where people actually think that when we say defund the police, what we mean is let's get rid of everybody. All the police officers are going to get fired. There's going to be this one day where they all lose their jobs and there's no more job of police officer. Abolish the police. What I'm talking about is that nightmare scenario that you have. My dream is that nightmare that those people have. My dream is that we have no more police officers, that they can all find other lines of work, and we can use that money, all of that money, not some of that money, but all of that money for community wellness. So abolish the police is just that. It's getting rid of police. Where we talk about defund the police, let's stop being scared of defund the police. When you're thinking about officer friendly in their job, they still get to keep their job. Two very, very different things that I hope any of your listeners can walk away with.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for explaining that, Roberto, and really summarizing, right, the differences, which I think hearing it again and again is really important, because as we know, sometimes narratives meld into one another in the mainstream media, and really that understanding can be lost. So I also want to, I know Pat's been waiting for this, and he's trying to jump in. So I just want to hand off the mic to Pat now, so that Pat can go for it. Yeah.
I have to tell you two things quickly. First off, this is one of those moments that represents really the culmination of, at this point, going on 8 years of effort in the creation of the coalition. And the reason I say that is because, first of all, I want to abolish the police now. The recognition that four different folks from four wildly different backgrounds, from four wildly different political belief systems, all right, have come to the identical conclusion at this point in as troubled a history as this day represents in our quote-unquote American experiment, to me, is amazing. And that's why this network exists. That's why it started out as a show sometime around 2012, 2013. I needed to point that out. First of all, I'd also like to welcome Ms. Bryant. Your predecessor, Fred, was on the show a number of years ago, and when we were talking about some of the protests probably, about 4 years ago that were going on, and we came to a pretty good agreement as well. And so I want to welcome you to the coalition, and I let you know that you're welcome here anytime. I'm a libertarian, as if anyone's shocked. I'm not going to read a big, deep, dark thing here, but I'm just going to give you the summary. Libertarians favor the abolition of government police departments for the same reason we favor the abolition of other government services. Government operation means they're inefficient, funded by coercion, have distorted priorities, such as revenue farming and prosecuting unconstitutional prohibitions, and lack accountability. So there's two ways to go for this. We've got a 12-point plan for how to reduce law enforcement violence. Ban knee holds and chokeholds, abolish qualified immunity, limit behind-the-back restraint, ban tasers, enforce the use of the force continuum, no shielding for misconduct and disciplinary history, national recertification denial for unwarranted life-threatening force, better training, tear down the blue wall, personal liability insurance for every officer, ban the rejection of recruits with hierarchies, ban all recognition of police unions, and then ultimately, what we really want to do is abolish the police, because ultimately, security should be accountable to the community with whom those folks are working in. until the moment that safety is made hyper-local and is accountable to that community, which hosts them, which implies and dictates the notion that the primacy is in the host community. It is not in a violent, out-of-control law enforcement community. Until that happens, we will continue to have abuses of power. And law enforcement, however that community chooses to employ it, should recognize that their first responsibility and to whom they work for is that direct community. And that the vision of that law enforcement should be, and only must be, the vision of that community. Police are the guests who are invited in at the discretion of that community. And until that happens, and it needs to happen now, Roberto, I ain't afraid of it. I say bring it on. And until that happens, then we will continue to have abuses dictated by a highly patriarchal authority complex that seeks to use the police for their own political and personal gain. That's all I got to say.
Thanks, Pat. So, I mean, it's, everyone clearly has while there's different entry points, I think really the core of what we all want to see is a community that feels safe within their own community, and a community that ultimately is not suffering under oppressive forces, whatever those forces may be. I'm always interested, it's a little outside the scope of what we're talking about here in terms of the practical approaches that you've all offered, given your respective ends, right? The ends that you hope to see. But you look at countries like Japan. I know, Roberto, you were in Japan with students, right? I mean, I lived in Japan for some time, and the crime rate is one of the lowest in the world. And look, they do have police. We can't say they don't. It's not like they have some alternative form of community policing, but there's something about the value system that they rebuilt their force with after World War II, right? So the values that they use to reconstruct their policing force and the passivity within it, I think that has contributed to not only ensuring that communities are safe, but also that communities feel safe, that they don't feel that they're being harassed by police officers. We just don't see instances of abuse, at least none that are publicly reported, right? At least not to the extent that we see in this country. So I'm always interested by that, right? Like, we live in a country that loves comparing itself to other countries, and yet there are police forces in other countries that have done something. I don't want to apply right or wrong to it, but they've done something differently. And there have been positive results as a consequence to that. And fundamentally, I do think it begins with the value system that was used to design a force. So when I asked Kia earlier about, when is it that you replace the new plan or the new system with the old system, and how quickly can that happen? If and when it does happen, I think what's important is for all of us to recognize that whatever value systems used to design that is going to dictate where we end up, whether we end up in the same place again or someplace far better. So I know that that's a little in depth and a little reflective, but I think that it's important for the audience to kind of take that away, right, when we're considering what practical approaches are to see the change that we have all presented here today. So with that said, this is a conversation that we need to push forward. We need to keep it going. We'll touch on it again. But we can't forget that while we're faced with this, systemic racism, we have seen that translate in other areas of our lives too, like healthcare. And it has really come to surface more than ever as a result of COVID-19. And specifically with COVID-19, just to provide some summary points, the world still is suffering under this pandemic. The US has exceeded 54,000 cases. States like Florida have exceeded 15,000 cases per day. Rhode Island, while it was dipping low, has just seen 100 new cases today, which is a concerning data point. All around the country, we're seeing a push to reopen not only businesses and schools, but this political narrative of my state is winning over other states relative to the number of tests we've done, without acknowledging the fact that even here in the state of Rhode Island, we have mostly done tests that are far less sensitive than the optimal tests that we should be delivering to our people. And the optimal, better test that we should be delivering is not even producing results within 2 to 3 days, as is expected for Rhode Islanders. It's taking 7 to 10 days, in some instances. And so there's a lot of concerning trends around how our testing system in Rhode Island and across the country is working. And there still is the question of a shortage of supplies. We are not out of the water, as they say, with supply shortages. And so what does that mean? And let me bottle this up for you. We are less than 2 months away from reopening schools, where we will be disposing, or I should say exposing, a population of children to a disease at numbers that we have not previously done. Children were protected. Youth was, for the most part, protected and contained during the stay-at-home orders. Now they're being pushed into high-risk environments, and they're going to need supplies. They're going to need masks. They're going to need sanitizer. They're going to need nurses, mental health workers, case managers, right? Health and safety officers within school to ensure that everything is operating at a level of quality that is very similar to a medical clinic. And if that infrastructure is not there for the students, if the testing supplies is not there for their students, where do those students go after they leave school? They go home. And COVID-19 spreads through families like wildfire, especially families that are in high numbers in very low quantity real estate, which, let's be honest, urban core communities, communities of poverty, communities of color, we are large families on average in very small living quarters. And so this is what we're faced with, right? I don't even want to take the narrative beyond where we might end up, but this is where we are. And what I'd love to hear from each person on this call, on this stream, is, what do you think? What do you think when you think about our children and schools reopening and the guidelines set in place and the lack of funding? What do you think? So let's start with Roberto from Steambox, Rhode Island, and get some perspective.
I can't even understand why we're pretending to have a plan. Why would we act like we have answers when we definitely have more questions than answers, right? Like the first time I saw our new superintendent in Providence speak on the reopening plan, they were very limited details. The idea of pods, which I guess if students are expendable, if our children are expendable in small numbers, the idea of keeping them together with one teacher at all times, so when they get sick, only they get sick, right? Like the idea of, so there's mild beginnings to a plan, but there's obviously so much more that's not worked out. And one of the questions that I and everybody else had after that briefing was the buses, and there was no answers about the busing situation. Well, working with a number of our districts in Rhode Island, I can tell you the plan for the buses as of this week. So as of this week, having worked with the different districts, the plan for the buses for programs that are happening right now, programs that are starting this week, where youth are coming in to have contact time with other people. The plan for those buses is if you're the bus driver and a parent walks with their student to the bus, you now have to ask them a bunch of questions where they are going to, they're going to self-inform. They're going to, I don't know if I'm saying that right. They're gonna inform about themselves if they have a fever, if they're feeling any of the symptoms like a dry cough and stuff like that. They have to report this to the bus driver. Now, if they do, and if they show up with a fever, and if they show up with a dry cough, and they even acknowledge it, hey, I have a dry cough today. Well, the bus driver has to say, all right, I'm sorry for the wellness of everybody else. You've got to go home with your mom, or your dad, or whoever walked you to the bus. They've got to take you back. But here's the thing: if their mom or dad didn't walk them to the bus, right? So if there's no adult accompanying them, and I understand some logic here, we don't want to send a sick kid trying to walk back when we've seen people go faint over this kind of thing. I get that, right? But the idea now is the way that we're going to handle it is if you show up and you clearly do have COVID-19, if you have the dry cough and the fever and you just look like, ill, the mandate is that they're going to put you on the bus with everybody else. That's what they have to do. If your parent is not there to take you back home, they're going to put you on the bus with everybody else and then work on it when they get to the school. And what I'm reading into, and I'm just focusing on that. I'm giving you one example, and there's so many more that are just like it. But at the end of the day, what I feel like is they are experimenting on our children. They're experimenting on our children, and it seems like X amount of children, it's okay for them to get sick and to spread this back into the community. Like X amount of the children, and thereby the community are now expendable. And I can't think of any way where that's okay. Nobody's expendable. Like which one of our children are expendable? Which one of our community members are expendable under this new proposed setup for the new school year? It's not making sense to me. Is it making sense to you?
No sense at all. No sense. So, Kia, what's your perspective on this? And, from a community standpoint, from a rights and equity standpoint?
I think that is disgusting. It's so, the racism is so blatant. It's ridiculous. Like, it makes me sad and angry, and I have a hard time sitting in rooms with these folks who are making these decisions, or sitting on Zoom calls with these folks who are making these decisions, because I'm looking at them like, do you really not care about the people in this community? You truly believe that opening up the school is the right idea? Honestly, with all of the data, with increased positive results that it continues to happen, and we're seeing it over and over again, right, in different locations, you honestly believe that that's the right thing to do? And the fact that these people in power don't care, that they're just, for whatever reason, rushing to send people back to school, open the state back up, is mind-boggling to me. I just don't understand it. Like, I get that it's racist, but I don't understand why it's. I just don't understand. I'm having a hard time reconciling with this stuff. Like, it's just.
Kia, I think a lot of people are going to have a hard time understanding. Can you touch more on? I'm sorry, Dr. Munoz. I just wanted to hear her expound on the race element of this, right? Like, and how does racism take a part in what I said? Because what I said seems at face value like a neutral across the board, beyond race, but Kia honed in on racism, and I agree. I was just hoping that she could, like, why does that ring as racist?
Because there are so many instances that I can think of where kids will be targeted for this stuff, right? I'm thinking about the neighborhoods that most of these kids live in that are going to be taking the bus. I'm thinking about, from my standpoint as a child, I did not have a parent walking me to and from school every single day. That just wasn't something that my mother, a single mother, was capable of doing. And if I got sick and I had to get sent home, or if I had to ride the bus with a bunch of perfectly healthy children, and I'm the sick one, putting their safety at risk, that's a problem. And thinking about the impact, the ripple effect that's going to have on families and communities of color is exponential. Like, these just things just never end. I'm thinking about, we already have a problem with kids making it home at reasonable hours when it comes to taking the bus. This is going to be a much longer process. I can imagine bus drivers are going to get frustrated, right? For a simple cough, kids are going to get sent home or kicked off the bus, right? The pod situation, I can imagine teachers not wanting to take the quote unquote problem kids, right? They're going to pick their favorites. Yeah, like there's just so many racist aspects to this that affect communities of color is just beyond me. Like yeah, I hope that kind of touched
Yeah, I
on
mean,
that for you.
let's not forget. I mean, Kia, to your point, right? Like, there was a study in the UK of people that died from COVID-19, and it was found that Black men died 4 times more, right, than non-Black men. And even when they took out underlying, right, when they took out underlying conditions, when they removed all those factors, socioeconomic status, so they took every other metric out of it and just based it on race, and found that they still die 2 times more than non-Black men. And so we know that the healthcare system, women of color in particular, right? I mean, die at higher rates when you compare procedures, even in OBGYN. So all of the systemic racism was present. Now it's just blatant, right? I mean, it's like in your face. And to your earlier point, Kia, I mean, taken aback, don't have the words to describe the feeling that surfaces when I see politicians on TV justifying or acknowledging systemic racism as a justification for action, which it's not. Acknowledging the fact that it exists does not imply in any way that we're taking actionable steps to addressing the issue. So what is my concern? When we're not investing in education, the consequences, right? So you talk about trauma, the generational trauma that concedes from my perspective starts with, if the students get sick in school, the schools close down, distance learning, the quality of education goes down for our communities because of no investment. Subsequently, if there are a small fraction of students that through a lottery system can go to 1 or 2 of the schools in Providence that have the resources, if those students are carrying the burden of now being the special ones into that school system, suddenly they have to abide by a double standard, a different standard than students that are in safe school districts, right? And that's like a perpetuation of what many of our lives are, always living by a double standard, always trying to, kind of meet the standard of a portion of society that does not adequately reflect the struggle that, we've gone through. And again, so my concern to your point, Kia, is like, it starts with not investing in school and safety around COVID-19, but everything that follows, it's an extreme of what we've already seen in our lives, given that I've only had 35 years of life, but
right.
Yeah.
But I mean, my 30s, definitely, I've seen a lot in 30 years, right? This shit just repeats itself over and over again, right? And unfortunately for us, but unfortunately for them, with COVID-19, they didn't have enough time to hide this racism, right? They didn't have enough time to cover it up. But we still see it for what it is. And then the simple fact that the data that's out there about Black and brown folks and pre-existing conditions, right? We know the data that's out there around systemic racism, period. Politicians ignoring that data that's out there and waiting to the last minute or waiting to be called out on their bullshit to say, oh, well, my bad, I'm sorry, let me offer you your translators, let me offer you your more testing sites, right? Like, yeah, we're sorry, we know you need these things, we knew you needed it already, but we forgot about you. Like, the fact that we're such an afterthought to people is like, we don't exist. Like, we have to make a little bit of noise just for you to say, oh, I'm sorry, like, we acknowledge your existence. Like, this is just I knew it. I knew that this was a thing. Like, I knew it, but to feel it, to see it happen right in front of my face over and over, mind-boggling. And I'm
all the more
angry.
reason to fight.
And
all the more reason to fight.
And it makes me want to burn shit down. Like I really do. It's firing me up.
So talk about politicians and lies. Bill, feel free to add your perspective on this, but if you could also share, I mean, what's the most recent omission? You can call it a data omission, you can call it a lie, but what's the most recent challenge that this administration's been faced with when addressing, COVID-19 issues?
Compliance by the citizenry and the folks who come to Rhode Island from other places. Right now, today, I've got the data in front of me here. We've got 100 new confirmed positive cases, right? Our peak previously was around 425 back at the end of April. So we're now spiking yet again, all right? Our testing mechanisms are producing numerous false negatives, particularly the Abbott test. That hasn't been corrected. The infrastructure hasn't been developed that needed to be developed to keep this at least at some level controlled moving forward. And we're seeing, certainly you can speak much more to the epidemiological element of this, doctor, but no question about it, it's in the mutation phase, and the virus is once again appearing as though it's going to get ahead of us. So we're simultaneously opening up schools, preparing to open up schools. We saw the average age of a COVID positive person in Rhode Island drop to 38 years old here in the latest batch. Okay. So we're seeing it trend downward towards, no offense, Pat, but into the zone of the other four of us here. You know what I mean? And out of your zone, maybe you're off the hook up there. But but the idea is now, look, we're seeing Bloomberg articles, MSNBC appearances, a lot of high-fiving. Full disclosure, I taped a couple of ads for the Department of Health about masks and this, that, and the other. The reality is, concurrently, we're seeing situations that we saw back at the beginning of this crisis in terms of the numbers, and it's going to trickle its way down into teachers. It's going to trickle its way down into students, bus drivers, and as the son of a retired school nurse teacher, I can tell you right now, and by the way, a good one who worked in hospital settings for years before moving into the educational sector. School nurses are not going to be able to manage this problem on their own. And as of right now, they're expected to. So it's a disaster not waiting to happen. It's the cards are in play. And really what it's going to come down to is leadership at this point, both convincing people to act in a more responsible manner without entering into totalitarianism and infringing on people's fundamental human rights. But we've got to remember that this is a disease that has exposed the racist, classist, systemic breakdowns in our world on a regular basis, and it's just going to continue to do so if we don't, number one, address the virus, but number two, address those fundamental breakdowns, starting with education. So it's a clown show right now. Anybody who thinks otherwise, they're out of their minds. Shouldn't be going back to school.
It is your turn, Pat. I know you've been asking some difficult questions in the pressers too. Feel free to take the reins.
I don't know what everyone in government is in such a goddamn rush to get kids back to these schools, because these schools suck to begin with. I have yet to see anything concrete occur, understanding that we're in the middle of this pandemic, but I have yet to see anything to stimulate a real desire to send children back into an unsafe, incompetently run warehouse. What's the there? There's certainly not healthy situations at these schools. They're well documented, and perhaps maybe they've cleaned up the act structurally. But in terms of teaching, in terms of actually accomplishing something, I call bullshit on that. The schools in the west end and the south end of this city are atrocious. And then they are so atrocious that that type of conditions would not be put up with people on the east side, and quite frankly, the people on the east side who can send their children to private schools, including most of our leaders. The notion that we have to have raffles, if you will, the moral equivalent of educational Keno, to decide who gets to change their life and break out of the bounds of poverty, systemic poverty, in a state where the state routinely attacks the visibly poor, to me is bullshit. So, I asked a couple questions, and I'm actually going to publish this link today, last Friday, about education. There are, and I'm obviously not the government guy, but the government that they worship has put in place all sorts of laws. And, if there's laws, they got to be important about how special ed children are being handled. There is no plan. So when I look at cities like Pawtucket and CF and Providence where the schools are failing, not the children, not some of the teachers, the children are being failed. So on top of that, we're going to put them in there under uncertain physiological terms. We have really no idea whether or not they're about to be impacting this generation, but I guess we'll roll the damn dice and see. This is a plan? This is education? Quite frankly, the children would be better off with their parents, even in a single-family working situation. They'd be better off with family than what we're sending them off to. So and to the degree that the physical condition of these schools is going to further impact COVID and how it's distributed amongst children, we have no idea. We're going to pile kids into tightly classrooms with adults who may or may not have come into contact. We don't know. It's outrageous. And the only reason I can think of, call me a cynic, is that there's a whole lot of money made by a whole lot of people, none of whom are in the community, if those children show up in those buildings every day. The teachers union certainly is, and Mary Beth Calabro, who's got plenty of time, whatever her name is, got plenty of time to rag on Trump, which is fine by me, but that's not really her gig. Sanctimoniously preaching to the community about this or that when she has overseen a failure in school systems unprecedented in American history. The governor who, we've got all these young children who can't read. What are we going to do about it? Federal law requires specific levels of remediation. I don't know. That's pretty much the answer. So I too am disgusted by it. And quite frankly, I think we are putting our children into cages in some of these schools, and we have no idea what the medical impact of that is going to be. And the notion that they would not put their children into them, but that they will put yours and mine, if I had young children and I lived in the city, it's all you need to know about Rhode Island government. Thank you.
Yeah, let's put it in perspective too, Pat. At the end of the day, students are a reflection of community, and community spread will impact schools. And if there's any spread in those schools, it'll impact the community as well. And frankly, I think for anyone outside of the urban core and communities of color, if you think that community spread in Providence, Pawtucket, and Central Falls will not reach East Greenwich or South Kingston or North Kingston, well, I think you're wrong. We have a small state. If stores and businesses are closed down in Providence and Pawtucket or in Central Falls, people will go to buy food elsewhere. They will go to seek entertainment elsewhere. And so when we're talking about these important issues about equity, allocation of resources, and protection of children, that is, just because they're children of color, do not think in any way that what happens to them will not in some way impact you, because the fact is we're all interconnected. So with that, I really want to take the last few minutes for everyone to really, express what their outrage is. What is it that will keep you up at night over the next week? What is it that has kept you up at night over the past week? So feel free, Kia, to lead the way. You're on mute, Kia, I think.
Every time. So many things keep me up at night. Where to begin? I think the coronavirus, most definitely, because it's still going. It's still alive and well, and nobody seems to give a shit. But also, I feel a revolution coming. I feel Rhode Island is waking up slowly but surely. They're waking up. I hear it from members who want to defund the police. So members want to abolish police. They don't necessarily know what it looks like. But they're tired. Folks are hurt. Folks are traumatized. We saw it from the finance committee meeting. Folks. So many people have been impacted negatively by police in many different ways, and to think about how deep the racism here in Rhode Island specifically is scary to me, because I used to be able to just feel it slightly, but it's everywhere. Like I cannot not see it, and that's what keeps me up at night, most definitely.
Thank you for sharing that, Kia. Pat, what's your outrage?
Well, it's largely focused around education. For folks who don't know me personally, my entire life is centered around education, educating my children. I've been blessed by for a number of reasons that my children were able to get a quality education, actually a very high-level education. I look at all kids as great kids, all kids as uniquely talented in one form or another. And, the fact that I've had a struggle, and I'm, a middle-class white guy, I've had a struggle financially in order to get them the education that they quite frankly deserve. I can't imagine what other people are going and other people are feeling, because I got lucky in a lot of ways. So I never had to send my children to public schools. That cost me dearly in so many ways I can't even imagine, but I was able to sidestep this mess. So when I hear that there's no plan, and I'm not gonna be redundant here. I think I just said it very well, but we're celebrating roughly a 1 year, I believe, since maybe a little over a year now, since the anniversary of the Johns Hopkins University report on the state of Providence, Rhode Island schools. And long before there was a pandemic, there was a well-voiced outcry on some of the editorial pages, not the op-eds, but the editorial pages of some of the most important newspapers, on the planet. No less than the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, all opined on the situation. There were lots of Tiger teams, there were lots of meetings, lots of idea generation, there were listening tours, and again, not a goddamn thing happened. I'm sure there have been superficial improvements, but the rate at which change is taking place can be summed up in one sentence. No one got fired. No one ever gets fired. There are no consequences. There are no recriminations. Everybody gets out alive. Reputation, pension, finances intact. And until people start getting fired, and until people start taking it personally in this damn state, and I mean personally, really personally, there will be no more fundamental change. So I don't advocate for violence. I don't advocate at all, even remotely. It's part of my personal philosophy. It's part of the libertarian philosophy, by the way, where you actually pledge not to use coercion or violence against others. But until there is a significant amount of civil disobedience and peaceful disruption in this state, nothing will ever change. It's time. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Bill, what's your outrage?
Quite simply, I've had enough of the the attitude that I've seen in certain parts of the state from folks, and I mentioned this last week, but look, is wearing a mask guaranteed to stop COVID from spreading? Of course not. But it's more about just this mentality that we're seeing in restaurants. I saw firsthand on the beach this weekend. I was in a place that's kind of like a, it's called Rejects. It's right next to the Bailey's, the beach club that Sheldon Whitehouse is a part of. All right. It's like a locals place. Everybody goes there. You know what I mean? It's a place where you go to hang out. Everyone has access to. That's the idea. And it was flooded with privileged tourists this weekend who crowded in. They're blasting corporate music. They're throwing footballs around. They're The football lands on your beach towel. Now you're expected to throw it back to them. They're setting up shop right next to you. Look, the idea is that whether you're a tourist, local, whatever it is, having disrespect for communities, whether it's in Providence, Newport, anywhere else in the state, to the extent that you're outwardly showing that you believe you're above the virus, that you believe that your experience is more important than that of others. We really are starting to learn just how careless so many people are in this state. And I felt it growing up in the woods. I went to Charahoe. I can still, think back to the dodgeball getting thrown off my face, or, the experiences that I saw with people of color in my school, or members of my family that are persons of color in that region. But that's now, I always thought, well, maybe that's just something that goes on in the sticks. Now we're starting to see it all over the state, this arrogance that somehow or another, because you're white upper middle class, you're going to escape coronavirus, and your experience and your summer is more important than the folks who have very little or a baseline minimum. And it's real, and the governor needs to step up and communicate to those people that, when the history books are written, they'll be the ones who are responsible for the fall of the American empire. Which might be a good thing, too, in a way, because it'll produce that civil unrest that Pat's looking for, right?
The revolution is coming. Roberto, what's your outrage?
My outrage is now that, according to Pat, I'm disqualified from being a libertarian ever, apparently, because of my violent nature. I was really, a lot of my outrage is about miseducation, right? And I don't even know if that's a real word, but it was an album cover for like Lauryn Hill, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill.
Until the IRS got her.
I disagree with Pat about a couple of things, and I think there's a couple of things that we don't really disagree on. It's just that there's no real solution. So here I am, a social introvert, right? I'm very introverted. When the idea of distance learning, the idea of working from home is ideal for somebody like me, despite the fact that I really want to be there for my students. I find ways to work towards my students virtually. My son is also he also has like this mild social anxiety. He doesn't freak out. He just prefers to be at home and on his own. So this has really worked out well for him. But as I check in with some of my students, I'm finding out that that's not true for everybody. Just because it's good for me, it's not good for them. And we should not be sending people to these experiments and these petri dishes and these unsafe conditions. And somebody here made the point, I don't remember who it was, but well before the pandemic, the conditions in Providence schools was unsafe to begin with. I can't walk into Gilbert Stewart Middle School without immediately becoming sick. It's just a fact, right? But here's where I really disagree with Pat. Pat said that nobody got fired. Well, untrue. You know who got fired? The wellness coordinators, right? The community outreach coordinators that were in the school, who was a team that was assembled to be a very diverse, it was a very black and brown crew working with students towards wellness. And when this happened, and right now we need wellness more than everybody. Steambox, I'm wearing this PBS. We got awarded some PBS stuff and a whole bunch of other really cool awards for our work in STEAM. All of that right now is pivoting to emotional and mental support for our students because they need it right now more than ever. They are hurting. So some of our students do need to be back in school. There are parents who need somewhere for their kids. And but here's the thing. I'm not saying we should send them back into the petri dishes. And I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is it doesn't seem to be a good solution. And meanwhile, if we're working on education and we're talking about miseducation, meanwhile, we've got people miseducating the community. How many times have we seen on our own social media from people who we respect from our community? I'm going to reference somebody who did a TED Talk, who's right here in Rhode Island, right? Which totally devalues the fact that I did a TED Talk because this idiot did a friggin' TED Talk. Here's her post. I can't believe there are people out there blaming Trump for COVID-19 when we know that Fauci and the WHO plus Bill Gates owns the pattern pattern on the virus, and that he has let Fauci and his sidekick get exposed. They created it, and the quote goes on and on and on, and it's absolute, like, it's just the highest level of stupidity. And I can count on that person for a post like, but this is somebody who's well regarded in our community. So we need to keep people out of the schools. I agree with all of you, and Pat spoke about it at length, but at the same time, some of these people really need school. And whether it's for childcare or whether it's for, and schools shouldn't equal childcare. I'm not suggesting that, but there are people, and this is where it comes back to a level of systemic racism, right? And even if it's not intentional, the idea of the urban core has more of a need. The system of the families requires, you know what I mean, a pattern of our kids are going to go to the school, and we're going to go to work, and everybody's going to work, and we're going to work 2 jobs. That's going to be found a lot more in the urban core, right? So in that whole time, when we should be dealing with education, we are right now dealing with miseducation, and it's really difficult. That's what's keeping me up at night.
And if I could jump in, Roberto, I think you and I actually agree, because I probably should have qualified my statement a little more carefully. I believe that young people should be in school. They just shouldn't be in these schools. And we have the finances and the will, and we have the skills, and we have the tools necessary to put them in schools that are safe and where they'll learn after we get a handle on exactly what we're dealing with here.
This brings us back to an earlier topic when we were talking about defund the police, right? Because now there's an opportunity. If we have bloated police departments but underfunded educational opportunities, well, maybe we rob from Peter to pay Paul.
I mean, let's wrap this up in terms of my outrage, if I will. So, when I'm hearing what's going on, I have to bring up Karina DeMong, right? One of the coordinators that was let go recently. We have wellness coordinators. We have people that serve as kind of, school liaisons between families and students. And really what they are is grassroots advocates in the school systems, bringing to light a lot of the social challenges and family, home challenges that students are confronted with. And we're stripping schools from that. I graduated from Central Falls High School. We all know Central Falls High School has a history of, being not well funded. There being radical steps taken by the state to fire teachers. There's been turnover. So even when people get fired, if the values that drive the allocation of resources towards a school system are not in line with what's moral and right, then ultimately the result is the same thing. And so we're even seeing in Central Falls school system today, the same board that went to school in Central Falls, some of those members, still making cuts in health education. Think about the implications of that, not only because we're in a pandemic, but health education, sex education. You talk about just everything that kind of grows from that in terms of creating individuals that are responsible, that understand wellness, that understand mental wellness. So we're creating a generation, we're stripping a generation, I would say, from resources so they can evolve and access the same opportunities in the future and the same well-being that's necessary to succeed. And so as that's happening, what outrages me is that those strategic defunding instances, right, ultimately are not met with much resistance. We see the same people on these boards in these school systems advocate for an administration that has defunded them, right? So what is the disconnect? One instance, they're saying we need more money by the state. The next instance, they're door knocking for this administration. So what is going on? We talk about arrogance, Bill brought up arrogance that we're seeing throughout the community, but I just want to bring to light that when Roberto and I and Kia and I are in the Equity Council meetings, what we're hearing from administrators is not humility. It's not we are truly concerned about what might happen, and we are trying our hardest to understand how we can allocate resources equitably. That's not what we're hearing. We're hearing, well, we've done this. We've hired consultants. Yeah, we've already thought about that. That's the tone in which they're speaking to community members and leaders that are attempting to advocate for them. And it's that arrogance that's going to get people killed. And it's that very arrogance from people that are tokenized, that have color, right, that is going to essentially continue to mislead or miseducate, to Roberto's point, members of our community. So unless we stand up and push against these individuals, push against that arrogance, force them into humility, and understand that when it comes down to it, it's all about where the money is placed. And the fact is that even before any defunding happens for the police department, this administration was given $1.25 billion and still has millions of dollars left that it's allocating to its own select group of businesses, its select group of organizations, and those that do its bidding. So if we want a revolution here in the state of Rhode Island, if we want a revolution in our communities, we need to step up now. We need to fight for those resources. And fighting for those resources is not just voting in November. Whoever tells you that is delaying you and trying to oppress your voice. Revolution, right? Stopping it now means rising up now, means going to the State House now, means pulling out every piece, every equipment, every idea, every ounce of energy that you have, and shouting at the top of your lungs that change is necessary. And if they're not willing to deliver it, then you're going to step into that building and take it on your own. So with that said, join us next week, 7:30 p.m. on Pump Up the Volume, where we will be talking about issues that the establishment does not want you to really understand in depth. We will be challenging the status quo. We will be amplifying voices of communities that are often unheard. Thank you so much to Mr. Roberto Gonzalez, Mr. Bill Bartholomew, Mr. Pat Ford, and of course, our special guest, Kirkbrae, Executive Director of DARE. Thanks again.